Hey everyone, it's week 8. We're going to be talking about ethics, trust, and autonomy. This is going to be a relatively short lecture from me, but that's not because this topic isn't important. It's because you have to go through all those other readings, and we need to give you some extra time to read those readings. But I thought it'd still be valuable to have a little bit of a discussion in this format to put things into context and maybe talk about some extra things that weren't covered in the readings. So obviously we've been talking about ethics all along, all the way from week 1 I would hope, but we really covered it in weeks 3 and 4 where we talked about performance, health, and safety. The ethics part of that would be the health and safety portion of it. We also formally covered it in Assessment 1 where we had to address ethical considerations about our design. So what we'll be doing this week is going to dig in a little bit deeper into this topic and also look at it in a little bit more of a structured way. And I say a little bit more instead of actually just saying in a structured way because we don't actually have an established framework for ethics in immersive design. We borrow it from lots of other places. So in the readings, for example, Beard and Longstaff, they talk about ethical principles for technology in general. And then we've got the Artificial Intelligence Ethics Framework discussion paper from the CSIRO. So we haven't really established a formal ethical kind of framework. We don't have, say, an equivalent Geneva Convention, for example. Still, what we do can affect society so much that we should really be thinking about this. So let's pull back a little bit and have a look at the 3 keywords in the topic title: ethics, trust, and autonomy. So I guess most of you would understand why we have ethics in here, because that's the topic. But what's this trust and autonomy part? Well, increasingly immersive design is colliding or intersecting with autonomy. For example, Mari Vilonaki was talking about designing a robot all the way back in week 5. We're increasingly becoming reliant on autonomous interactive virtual characters or real characters in our immersive designs as well. Either in a fictional setting where the goal of the design is to convey some kind of narrative design. It's basically a story. Or something a little bit more real, like in an edutainment situation where you have a guide, for example, going through a museum. Or it could be an industrial or operational situation where you have an autonomous agent helping an operator do a task. A very simple example of this would be an autopilot, for example. And as we discussed, that's still part of immersive design because we are trying to design the cockpit as low cognitive load as possible. We use principles like ecological interface design to heighten or increase the chances that the aeroplane won't crash. So anyway, this is a bit of an extension on the integrity of the individual. So what I mean by that is just like in weeks 3 and 4, we've been talking about human physical safety, and then we've also discussed things like personal privacy. And I guess this is where most people's minds go to when we say ethics. But we shouldn't be forgetting things like equitable access and wider effects on society. Now, we kind of covered it in a ad hoc way when we were talking about your Assignment 1 designs. But here we're really going to put it into focus. In the readings, we have Sarah Hubbell talk about designing for access, designing for disabled people. And that's something that we don't really think too much about as immersive designers. I guess the very multimodal nature of this medium, well, it encourages us as designers to use as many of the modes as possible, right? So, visual, haptics, audio, basically everything. But what Sarah asks us to consider is not everyone have these senses fully operational, so we can't, they can't actually take advantage of all the different affordances that we would give them. So if our user is visual impaired, like Sarah is, or if they're completely blind, how would we design for those people? What if they're deaf? What if they can't walk? If we stop just to think about these you'll find that we actually have a bunch of solutions already. And you'll be happy to know that a lot of them are already free. It comes from the very fact that we're doing immersive design. For example, if we're talking about less mobile people, having them go through a virtual environment, let's say in a virtual reality headset, would actually allow them to be a bit more mobile than they actually otherwise would. And we did cover that in some of the therapeutic applications of immersive design. And we might be able to go a little bit further than that, because if we remember back in week 5, we also talked about brain-computer interfaces and how it can actually be used to control external devices such as wheelchairs or even prosthetic limbs. In the case of completely blind people, neural interfaces also allows us to basically replace their eyesight. So I think we talked about bionic eyes in there too. But we can't just magically solve everything with technology. In fact, a lot of the things that I talked about, especially with BCIs, are not up to the level of development, level of maturity where it's actually accessible by most people. The biggest fundamental barrier at the moment, I guess, is the technology isn't, developed fully yet. So, for example, bionic eyes, the very low resolution, people can only really see extra shades of gray or little pixels here and there. But that's better than completely nothing, right? But I guess the other thing that we need to think about is these devices are super, super expensive. So even if the technology was actually up to scratch, this still wouldn't be accessible to most people around the world because there would be the socioeconomic barrier. And us as immersive designers also need to think about that. And so that's part of equitable access. Recently, I guess I'd say in the past 5 years or so, schools have become really interested in immersive technologies to help them with their curriculum. But as we learned in week 2, there's very specific minimum requirements for technology. For example, just to avoid motion sickness, we need high frame rates, low latency, and the rendering hardware that we need for that is quite expensive. I guess even now, even though we have consumer devices like the Meta Quest, it's still pretty expensive, like $500. That's like half an iPhone, and most of the population in the world, that's just prohibitive. So what do we think about that? What's our responsibility in this situation? Do we have any responsibility as immersive designers where we are not hardware manufacturers? We don't own the platforms, we don't set the prices. There is a temptation to cheap out on the hardware, and at the moment there's no shortage of second-rate companies trying to jump in on the hype. And when I say second-rate, I mean people that are trying to manufacture or promote basically unsafe devices or technological solutions because they've saved some money by cheaping out on some of the hardware. Do we have any influence in this area at all as immersive designers? I'll just leave that as an open-ended question. And we also have to worry about societal effects as well. I guess as immersive designers, we're very aware of the benefits of immersive design throughout the rest of society. In earlier weeks of this unit, we talked about all sorts of health applications, and we talked about educational applications. The cultural contribution to humanity from immersive design is immense, in my opinion, anyway. But we have to go into this with both eyes open. Immersive design is a tool, right? So just like fire, it can be used for great benefit, but because the tool is so powerful, it can also be used for great harm. So we need to come into this with a full awareness of the dangers that we could unleash on society. We can't enumerate every single thing, it's still an evolving field, but we should keep a lookout for things that are already going wrong, and that's the kind of thing that we discuss in class. The readings might give you some ideas, but you might have seen a story just in the media about some things to do with immersive design that isn't quite right. And it's our responsibility as designers to know about these things, so in future our designs aren't
susceptible to these kinds of negative effects. Now, it is possible to predict these negative effects just by thinking about it at the design stage. We don't necessarily have to release something into the wild, wait for something bad to happen, and then say, oh, that's bad, we should probably go fix that. Now, one nice distilled framework that we might possibly use is Casebeer's 3 C's. So Casebeer is one of our readings this week, but I just wanted to focus us on his 3 C's. And it goes like character, consent, and consequence. Now, this doesn't really negate all the other frameworks that we present to you in the readings, but I thought this was a pretty nice, concise one. If we applied this 3 C's to our design, we could be pretty confident that whatever we end up designing isn't too horrible. Paraphrasing for the sake of time, the first C, character, basically asks if our design will change the user's character in some way, either subtly or overtly. And is this change actually a positive thing for the person individually and for the rest of society? And you can very readily apply these questions to, say, training situations. But you can also apply this to more subtle and insidious things, like, for example, gambling games are specifically and psychologically designed to get people addicted and put in as much money as they can. And this is probably the most contentious genre in game design. And if you're curious about all the different points and counterpoints, I encourage you to go down that path. But I won't because we're running out of time. Alright, let's go to the second C, consent. And that's pretty straightforward. Do the stakeholders in this entire transaction, in this entire design, actually consent to everything that's happening? So privacy policies would fall under this category. And the question in this particular example is, do your users actually know exactly what you're taking from them in terms of data, and have you given them enough opportunity to either agree to it or not? But of course, that's just one example. Questions of consent go much deeper than that. For example, in our collaborative environments, or like multi-user environments, sexual harassment is now becoming a thing, just like it is in real, face-to-face situations. It's also coming into the quote-unquote metaverse, so that's something we need to think about. And the final C, consequence, encourages us to ask the question, what consequence does our design actually have on the rest of society? Not just the individual user, not just the other stakeholders around the design, but the rest of society as well. Okay, last slide. You'll see some of Casebeer's 3 C's in this, actually. That's why I find the framework so convenient. Let's see if I can go through all these in 3 minutes, hey? So, trust calibration in human autonomy interactions. So this is basically my PhD topic. And if I were to try and simplify it in just a minute, then it's basically trying to make sure that people don't trust autonomy too much, because they're going to die, and we shouldn't make it so that people don't trust the autonomy at all, because they're also going to die. So trusting autonomy too much is overtrust, and you can see examples of this when people sleep in their Teslas while it's doing autonomous driving, and then they die, because the driving assist function isn't actually fully autonomous yet. Undertrust or disuse is when people turn off autonomy completely because it annoys them. For example, in the automatic signal systems for a train network, cascading collisions happen throughout the entire network, and then people also die. These are the most extreme examples that I'm mentioning, but yes, generally trust calibration in human-computer interaction or human autonomy interaction is really important. And we don't quite know how to do it yet. Okay, next point, unconscious bias and discrimination. So Belinda Yee already talked about the inadvertent racism of loan granting algorithms, but you might remember the case of the Google image classification algorithm classifying black people as gorillas. And that's particularly bad because the term gorilla was a racist slur that's been leveled at black people, particularly in America. What are the issues around this? And it's important to think about these sociologists and really high-ranking academics, mostly in the arts anyway, are actually questioning the very foundations of science just because of these cases. But that's not very helpful, because if you question the foundations of science and say science is racist, where does that leave us? Science has been the engine of human progress and enlightenment for the last, however many thousands of years since the beginning of civilization. Yeah, we better clear that up. We better fix that quick. We're already dying of climate change, and that's come about because of science denial. So now we're thinking, let's fix society by saying that science is bad. Anyway, next 2 points: exploitative data practices and data security. We already have an inkling of what this is about because we've discussed it before, and also we probably would have heard about this just in general even before coming into this course. But we need to be even more vigilant of this, because in immersive design we can do even more damage. For example, there was this one study that showed that you could actually identify someone just by using their movement information given through how they move with the headset and the hand controllers. Like they just need 5 minutes of data, and then you can positively identify someone with something like 90% plus accuracy of who that is. So that's scary. So that negates a lot of our data security practices like before immersive design. But now that we have all these biometric data points, it's actually pretty easy to identify someone. So anyway, that's probably enough to think about over time again. See you in class.